Hi, in this episode, we're sorting out a topic that in recent months has easily been boiled down to a single slogan: artificial intelligence in machinery. A convenient shorthand has emerged around the Machinery Regulation 2023/1230. The new regulation governs artificial intelligence in machinery. It sounds modern, it sounds catchy, but it's imprecise. The new regulation is not an AI Act. It doesn't regulate every algorithm used in a production plant. It doesn't say that a system analyzing line data, predicting failures, or suggesting process settings automatically becomes part of the machine's conformity assessment. If such a system operates alongside the machine and doesn't perform a safety function, the mere buzzword artificial intelligence doesn't make it a machine safety component. The machinery regulation is interested in something else. It asks whether a given solution can affect the safety of the machine and humans. This distinction is crucial. If a safety component or a system embedded in a machine has fully or partially self-evolving behavior, uses machine learning, and performs safety functions, then the topic falls squarely within the scope of the regulation. But this is not a regulation of artificial intelligence in machinery as such. It is a regulation of a machine or a safety component in which machine learning affects safety functions. That's why it's not worth starting with the question of whether a machine has artificial intelligence. A better question is who or what can change the machine's behavior, because the real change in the new regulation is broader than artificial intelligence. The new rules show much more strongly that a machine doesn't end with mechanics, drives, guards, and an electrical cabinet. A machine can be a system whose safety depends on software, data, control logic, communication, remote access, updates, configuration, and resilience to digital interference. And this is where the real work of the manufacturer and integrator begins. It's not enough to ask if we have CE on the components. You have to check whether assembling these components into a single machine or assembly of machinery has created a new risk. It's not enough to just tell IT. You have to check whether a data error, loss of communication, configuration change, or software update can lead to a hazardous situation. It's not enough to just write in the documentation, cybersecurity considered. You have to show where cyber can affect machine safety and what measures have been applied. That's precisely why ISO 12100 doesn't lose its significance after the new regulation comes into force. On the contrary, it becomes even more important. It provides the logical framework: machine limits, intended use, reasonably foreseeable misuse, life cycle phases, operator tasks, hazards, hazardous situations, dangerous events, risk reduction measures, and residual risk. Only on such a framework can you sensibly add a layer of cybersecurity. For example, using IEC 62443, and check the relationship with the CRA, that is, the Cyber Resilience Act. Let's look at this with a simple example. A machine has remote service access. Someone exploits a vulnerability, a misconfiguration, or weak account security and uploads a modified program to the PLC. At first glance, nothing has changed. The guards are still in place. The emergency stop button is still red. The component declarations are still in the documentation. The nameplate still looks professional, except that the machine might already be operating differently. The sequence of movements might have changed. The stopping delay might have changed. The speed might have changed. The restart condition might have changed. The reaction to opening a guard might have changed. A control that previously limited risk might have disappeared. And then saying it was just an IT incident is too weak. If the result can be a machine movement at the wrong moment, a failure to stop, an unexpected restart, or human access to a danger zone, then we have a potential dangerous event in the machine's risk assessment. Second example, connecting a machine to a SCADA system. Is this always a problem? No. If SCADA only reads data, the risk may be limited. You still need to check it, but mere process monitoring doesn't necessarily change the machine's safety. But if SCADA can change recipes, parameters, operating modes, permissions, cycle sequences, or restart conditions, then we're no longer talking about simple data viewing. We're talking about an external influence on the machine's behavior. And then you have to go back to the beginning, to the machine limits. A machine that was previously a standalone workstation may operate under different conditions after integration with a supervisory system. It has different dependencies, different command sources, different possible errors, and different situations in which the operator might be caught off guard. And here, a single sentence won't suffice. SCADA is on the customer's side. If it affects the machine's behavior, it must be included in the risk assessment. Third example, relocation. We often hear, after all, it's just moving a machine, but not always. Imagine a machine designed and assessed for a plant where no seismic activity was expected. Then that same machine ends up in a place where earthquakes are a real environmental condition. Does the move itself automatically mean a substantial modification? No. But if the new conditions require additional measures for stability or mechanical strength, it stops being just logistics. A new dangerous event appears that wasn't previously within the practical limits of the machine's use. And then you have to ask the uncomfortable question, are we still assessing the same machine within the same machine limits? Documentation doesn't describe a machine suspended in a vacuum. It describes a machine under specific conditions. Where it works, who operates it, what tasks it performs, what its operating modes are, what environment surrounds it, and what situations can be reasonably foreseen. If these conditions have changed, the risk assessment cannot pretend nothing happened. What do these three examples have in common? The problem doesn't start with a buzzword, not with artificial intelligence, not with SCADA, not with remote access, not with relocation, not with a software update. The problem starts when the machine's behavior, its conditions of use, or the way humans interact with it change. And that's why a risk assessment, according to ISO 12100, doesn't start with a list of protective measures. It starts with the machine limits. Only then can you sensibly move on to hazards, hazardous situations, dangerous events, risk estimation, and risk reduction. Without this, it's very easy to produce documentation that looks correct but describes an old reality. And a machine after integration, relocation, an update, or connection to a supervisory system may already be a different reality from a safety perspective. The Machinery Regulation 2023/1230 changes things. First, let's be clear. The regulation doesn't reinvent risk assessment from scratch. Machine limits, intended use, reasonably foreseeable misuse, the hierarchy of protective measures, technical documentation, instructions, and the declaration of conformity were already in Directive 2006/42/EC. So this isn't a story about how, from 2027, you have to do a risk assessment. That would be untrue. The change lies elsewhere. The regulation adds things to the old world of machinery that can no longer be treated as an afterthought. Software, data, software performing safety functions, machinery without software installed yet for a specific application, safety components in digital form, autonomous systems, remote start, control systems resilient not only to failures but also to reasonably foreseeable attempts by third parties to cause a hazardous situation. The directive was written for machinery that could, of course, have controls, software, and automation, but the regulatory focus was still very traditional. Machine, drive, guard, control system, manual, CE declaration. The new regulation already describes a machine as a product living in a system. A product that can be connected to a network, can be updated, can depend on data, can operate autonomously, can have digital components, and can change its behavior through software. It can be modified not only physically, but also digitally. And that's why technical documentation stops being a place where you throw in a few diagrams, declarations of conformity, manuals, and risk tables just to have them. The documentation is meant to show the manufacturer's line of reasoning, which essential requirements apply, what hazards were identified, what protective measures were applied, what standards were used, and what residual risk remains, and where relevant, how software, data, sensors, remote control, or autonomy affect safety. So it's not that everything is new, it's that old obligations have taken on a new weight. Because a machine in 2027 is no longer just mechanics and electrical systems. It is a technical, digital, and organizational system that must be assessed as a whole. In practice, this is visible in several areas. First, a machine may be almost ready, but without software. If a machine is only meant to function after specific software is installed, then that software is not an add-on. It is part of what determines its function, behavior, and safety. So, the question is not just whether the physical construction is complete. The question is also whether the software, without which the machine cannot perform its intended application, has been included in the conformity assessment. If not, the documentation describes a dummy machine, not the machine the user will actually run. Second, a safety component can be digital. The regulation explicitly adds that a safety component can be physical or digital, including software. This is the end of the simple thinking that machine safety resides solely in a guard, light curtain, interlock, safety relay, or emergency stop button. If software performs safety functions, it is no longer just an automation engineer's program. It is a safety component or part of a safety-related control system. And then you have to be able to answer specific questions. Who supplied it? Which version is installed? Can it be changed? Who has access? Is the change logged? Can an update change safety functions? Does the technical documentation allow you to demonstrate conformity? Many companies won't fail because they don't have good automation engineers. They will fail because their documentation won't show how software decisions were linked to the machine's risk assessment. Third, cybersecurity enters machine safety. However, we must be precise. The new regulation doesn't turn a machine manufacturer into a cybersecurity firm. It does something else. It says that if accidental or intentional corruption, interference, data alteration, software modification, or external influence can lead to a hazardous situation, then it is a machine safety issue. This is a major mental shift. It's no longer enough to write remote access password protected. You have to show whether remote access can affect safety-critical functions at all. If it can, you must describe the risks and measures. If it can't, it's good to be able to justify it. Fourth, technical documentation must show more than just that the company has diagrams. In appropriate cases, you must include the source code or programming logic of safety-related software. You must describe sensor-controlled, remotely started, or autonomous systems if safety-related actions depend on sensor data. You must show the characteristics, capabilities, limitations of the system, data, and testing and validation processes. In other words, technical documentation must stop being a file archive. It must be proof that the manufacturer understands why this machine is safe. Fifth, Annex 1 has a new logic. In Directive 2006/42/EC, we had Annex 4. In the regulation, Annex 1 appears, divided into Part A and Part B. This is not just a change in numbering. Part B largely resembles the familiar world of high-risk machinery, where under certain conditions, internal production control is still possible. Part A is stricter. That is where, among other things, safety components with fully or partially self-evolving behavior using machine learning that perform safety functions and machinery with such systems embedded end up with respect to those systems. And only here does artificial intelligence become really important, not because the machine has AI, but because machine learning performs safety functions. This is a completely different weight of responsibility than an algorithm for production reporting or predictive maintenance. Sixth, instructions and declarations can be digital, but not just online in any old way. The regulation allows user manuals and EU declarations of conformity in digital form. This is good news for manufacturers, but only if someone reads the requirements to the end. The digital manual must be accessible in a way indicated on the machine, product, packaging, or accompanying document. It must be printable, downloadable, and savable. It must be available online for the expected life cycle of the machine and for at least 10 years after it is placed on the market or put into service. This is not the same as throwing a PDF file onto a website that no one in the company remembers after 3 years. Digitizing documentation doesn't eliminate obligations. It creates new organizational obligations. Seventh, the importer and distributor are no longer bystanders. The importer must check whether the manufacturer has carried out the appropriate conformity assessment procedure, whether the technical documentation has been drawn up, whether the machine bears the CE marking, whether it is accompanied by the required documents, and whether the required identification and contact details are provided. The distributor can't pretend to just move boxes either. Before making a machine available on the market, they must check, among other things, the CE marking, the EU Declaration of Conformity, the instructions and information in a language understandable to users, and the manufacturer's and importer's details. This doesn't mean the distributor automatically becomes the machine designer, but it means there is less room in the supply chain for a convenient, "I didn't know." Eighth, autonomous machines are no longer a novelty. The regulation explicitly introduces the concepts of an autonomous mobile machine, a supervisor, and supervisory functions. The risk of an autonomous mobile machine is not just that something is moving. It's about who or what makes the decision to move, how the machine detects people and obstacles, what happens in the absence of supervision, what the working zone looks like, how the machine behaves when communication is lost, whether it can operate without an active supervisory function, and whether the supervisor has a real view of the situation. In a traditional risk assessment, it was easy to focus on visible elements: wheels, drive, brake, and warning signal. In an autonomous machine, you have to go deeper into decision logic, sensors, working area limits, reaction to obstacles, and the role of the human as a supervisor rather than a traditional operator. Ninth, the Cyber Resilience Act will be a separate layer, but it won't replace the machine's risk assessment. The machinery regulation applies to the safety of machinery, related products, and partly completed machinery. It is interested in cybersecurity when it can affect machine safety. The Cyber Resilience Act applies to products with digital elements and introduces its own cyber resilience requirements. These are not the same acts, and they don't solve the same problem. The manufacturer of a digital component may be responsible for their product under the CRA, but the machine manufacturer or integrator still has to assess what happens after embedding that component into a specific machine, a specific control system, a specific network, and a specific working environment. In other words, the CRA can help with the quality of the digital component. EEC 62443 can help organize automation cybersecurity, but ISO 12100 is still needed to answer the question of whether all of this affects the machine's risk. There is one more thing that looks like a formality but can overturn documentation. The EC Declaration of Conformity becomes the EU Declaration of Conformity. The Declaration of Incorporation becomes the EU Declaration of Incorporation. The old Annex 4 of the directive must now be read through Annex 1 of the regulation. And after the corrigendum, the date of application of the regulation must be read as January 20th, 2027. You might say formalities. No. It is precisely in such details that you can quickly see whether a company has truly updated its conformity process or just did a find and replace operation on the old declaration template. After January 20th, 2027, an old EC Declaration of Conformity, an old reference to Directive 2006/42/EC, an old Annex 4, and an old technical documentation template won't be minor editorial errors. They will be a signal that the CE process has not been adapted to the new Act. And that usually means something worse, that no one checked whether the product classification, conformity assessment procedure, scope of technical documentation, method of describing software, user manual, declaration, or the role of economic operators had changed. In the new approach, the EU Declaration of Conformity should not be a generic sentence like the machine complies with the regulation. The declaration must show by what path the manufacturer demonstrated conformity, which harmonized standards were applied, whether they were applied in full or in part, what common specifications or other technical specifications were used, and what conformity assessment module was applied. This changes the declaration from a simple statement into a document that shows the path of conformity. It's not enough to write, "The machine meets the requirements." You have to show by what procedure the manufacturer demonstrated this. And that's precisely why the biggest mistake in transitioning from the Machinery Directive to the Machinery Regulation 2023/1230 will be treating this change like an update to a declaration template. That doesn't work. It's not enough to change EC to EU. It's not enough to swap the legal act number. It's not enough to delete one field and add a new date. It's not enough to enter a few standards that look good. It's not enough to write in a module without checking if it actually results from the correct procedure. A correct update means going through the entire conformity path. You have to check whether the product is a machine, a related product, or partly completed machinery. You have to define the machine limits. You have to perform a risk assessment. You have to identify the applicable essential requirements. You have to check Annex 1, Part A, and Part B. You have to select the correct conformity assessment module. You must correctly describe the involvement of a notified body, if required. You must specify the concrete standards, common specifications, or other technical specifications used to demonstrate conformity. You must correctly distinguish between the manufacturer, authorized representative, importer, and distributor. You must prepare an EU declaration of incorporation for partly completed machinery, and you must have technical documentation that actually supports the declaration. This is the real test. A company that truly understands the new machinery regulation doesn't just update the final document. It updates the entire process, from product classification through risk assessment and module selection to technical documentation, instructions, declarations, and product liability. Therefore, the most important takeaway from this episode is simple. Don't ask first if the machine has artificial intelligence. Ask who or what can change its behavior. Ask whether software, data, remote access, an update, a supervisory system, or a change in the working environment can affect human safety. If the answer is yes, then the topic must return to the machine's risk assessment, because in the new world, conformity doesn't end with the CE mark. Conformity begins with understanding how the machine actually works, who can affect its behavior, and what risks arise from this for humans. And that is precisely why the Machinery Regulation 2023/1230 is not just a story about artificial intelligence. It is a story about the machine as a technical, digital, and organizational system that must be assessed as a whole.